Hello and welcome back to my highly irregular and lately quite absent series of Storyteller Talks. My name is Joan and I'm one of the storytellers or GMs or whatever you want to call us here at CharismaToAC. I am by no means the only one, as most of you should be aware of by now, but I am the one who's running A Song of Tara, which is the longest running campaign we have been uploading so far. Today I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on pre-written versus freeform campaigns. The reason for this is I run both. One of the campaigns that we are in fact not uploading is, or at least we're not uploading anymore, is a campaign in the Pathfinder system, the heir and successor in some ways to the D&D D20 system, also known affectionately amongst at least the players of our group as D20 done right. I'm running a campaign there called Jade Regent. We did upload it for a little while. However, we're running that campaign in Danish, which is the native language of everyone in the group, with the exception of Chris. And since he wasn't in the group, we ran it in Danish, which obviously limits the listening audience quite severely. This is a small country with a limited role-playing population. But I do run this campaign. It's pre-written. It's a campaign that has been released by Paizo Publishing. Paizo, Paizo, are the people who bought the license to the D20 system from Wizards of the Coast when they decided to put it up for grabs, and this is why they then went on and created the Pathfinder system, complete with its own world, Golarion, where all of their campaigns take place. Jade Regent is a 6-book campaign. Each book, or should you say booklet, isn't exactly massively thick. It's about 50 or 60 pages worth of campaign and fluff, and it's well written. In fact, the campaigns I've seen from Paizo so far have all been well written. They're well thought out. They have an interesting cast of characters, and NPCs and locations and so on and so forth. And of course we have the alternative, which is A Song of Tara, which is a completely free-form campaign. It's homebrewed. It comes straight out of my demented mind. It's not. I do a little bit of preparation. Obviously, I spend quite a lot of time on NPCs, on opponents, on villains, and so on and so forth. But it's not pre-written. I usually don't have much written down in terms of plot line, and I kind of let the characters go their own way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of both of these, at least as I see it. And again, obviously, this is not a matter of me having found the great universal truth about which type of campaign is preferable, or anything I'm saying here should absolutely go for everyone in the world. But I'm hoping it might lead to, I don't know, some introspection from a few of you out there who might be interested in running games of your own. And let me start out by addressing the huge, enormous 6-ton bull elephant in the room. The advantages and disadvantages in terms of how easy are these campaigns to run. And I'll be honest, I personally think that a pre-written campaign is by far the easiest to run, because most of the work has already been done for you. whereas a free-form campaign requires much greater investment of time and effort, and quite frankly, it's a bigger strain mentally, because you have to come up with something on the fly constantly. The players never quite do what you expect them to, as I've mentioned in a previous video in this series. So yes, for me at least, the pre-written campaign is easier, and it is something I would probably suggest at least to new GMs out there. Try to find a campaign which is user-friendly for new people in the hobby. You can find information about what campaigns are good for various levels of experience quite easily. Google it and you will be able to find a significant amount of reviews of basically any campaign, pre-written campaign out there, or adventure path as Paizo calls them, or whatever terminology you prefer. But there are lots of helpful sites and hints out there, and even if you don't know the name of any such campaign, simply Google such things as easy first time Pathfinder campaign, or I'm sure you can come up with how to go about finding such a thing. It is not difficult. The point of a pre-written campaign, at least, is that you have a narrative laid out before you. You have a clear stated objective. In the case of Paizo's campaigns, you have a clear stated objective, both overall for the entire campaign and for each book in the series. So you have these partial goals you can work towards in order to get to the ultimate great victory at the end. This, of course, is an advantage, but it also, in my opinion, means that it's quite easy to, as the term goes, railroad your characters. Some people don't mind that, but a lot of people do. And railroading characters, of course, means that you put them on a set of tracks and they can't really veer off the tracks, because then, you know, the train is going to topple over and burst into flames, and everyone on board is going to die horribly and gruesome deaths in a flaming inferno of steam train debris. Just to take the metaphor to its gruesome conclusion. The thing is, you can go outside what is written. Obviously, you can, but part of the problem with that is that the campaign is usually designed for a certain power level, and if you go outside of that campaign a lot and you give people XP for going outside a campaign narrative, then they will end up quite probably being too strong for the campaign, and that will leave you with extra work trying to change the campaign, buff the encounters, so on and so forth, and suddenly you may find yourself in quite hot water, especially if you're not all that experienced yet. For that reason, it's at least for new GMs, I wouldn't recommend doing that. Even for people with more experience, be very careful of doing that. We've had this situation arise in our own game group. Heine, whom most of you by now should be familiar with from several of our games, he runs the new game we're uploading now, Hereticus, and he is a player in A Song of Tara, where he plays Liam, and initially Connell. He is he originally ran, when I joined this group, he ran a a campaign in Pathfinder called Way of the Wicked, which is an absolutely brilliant piece of campaign writing, in my opinion. It allows players, it is for more experienced players, I will say, but it allows players to be not just bad guys, but the actual villains. You sort of expect when you play that campaign that somewhere out there are adventuring parties that have set out to put an end to your evil ways. Because it is, you are evil Mac Evilstein with a side dish of evil combined with evil. Also, you're slightly evil. And if you hadn't picked up on it yet, you are really, really evil in that campaign. And it was a brilliant campaign, but Heine, through no fault of his own, got a group of players who all, or at least several of us, loved to continuously supply him with an overabundance of possible side stories, and eventually he simply couldn't handle the amount of preparation that was involved in it at the same time as taking care of a full-time job and having a family. So the campaign ended prematurely, which we as players were extremely sad about, and we hoped for a long time that the campaign would start up again. It never did, and by now it's been too long anyway. But the point of it is, if you allow players to do that in a pre-written campaign, the workload is simply going to explode. If you look at it from a freeform campaign sort of perspective, you might think that the problem is the same. That if people supply you with an overabundance of side quest material, that's still going to be too much, and obviously it can be, but it's not. It's less likely to be, for the simple reason that the side quests are really most of the story. That's what the story is primarily made up of. Is would be the players and the characters creating their own story from the get-go. You don't have a pre-written narrative that they need to somehow stick to and get to the end of in any way. Some players obviously prefer one or the other, and some players, we have had this in our group as well, very strongly prefer that even in pre-written campaigns that the pre-written story takes a backseat to the player's own narratives, and to each their own, obviously. But personally, I'm of the opinion that if you play a pre-written campaign, then it's usually because you're actually interested in that story, and going too far off kilter is going to be, it's gonna, I won't say it's going to ruin the experience, but it's certainly going to diminish from the experience of the main narrative. That's both my experience and my opinion. I personally don't enjoy doing that too much. It's something I used to think was fun, and then the Way of the Wicked situation happened, and I realized from that experience that one should keep the shenanigans of character-centric side quests, if not to a minimum, then at least to a manageable level, in such campaigns. Again, in a freeform campaign, this is not really the problem, as you probably see if you are regular listeners to our account or our page here, our site, and if you have been following the misadventures of our young werewolves in Dublin, you should probably know by now that side quests are a fairly significant part of that story. Recently we have been dealing quite extensively with the messed up romantic lives of some of them. My goodness gracious, it's been Melrose Place at times. But there's room for that in a freeform campaign. I have an overarching narrative, but I have, in fact, in A Song of Tara, I have several overarching narratives. There's, quite frankly, they have 3 or 4 different main quests that they can pick and choose between at any given time, and then I will focus on that main quest, whatever it is they choose to go for. It also means that you can, in my opinion, create a much more realistic and alive game setting with a freeform game, because things happen in the background to a much greater extent. In a pre-written campaign, there may be what is collectively known as a doomsday clock, where you have to accomplish a certain task within a certain set time frame. That happens in pre-written campaigns. There are several of them that are written like that, in I suppose in many different game systems. And if you don't complete the quest within the time of this doomsday clock ticking away, then something happens, something terrible happens off screen, or an event takes place that makes your further progress either a whole lot harder, or maybe even in some extreme cases impossible, and the campaign comes to an end. That's entirely possible to find. I personally prefer it in the freeform method, where, let's take an example from A Song of Tara, where the players are heading or are trying to complete Aaron's War. They're trying to fight off the vampires and finish off this this centuries-long Cold War in a very direct and not very cold manner. They finally, real war has broken out, and people are dying left, right, and center. But while this is happening, and while they are pursuing this situation, Pentex is still working in the background to poison the waters and and destroy the Irish countryside, and so on. And because the players chose to focus extensively, or in fact exclusively, on Aaron's War, Pentex had time to do these things. They had time to do several really dastardly things. An even more obvious example would be that because they have spent so long before they actually dealt with the more recent enemies of Gina Masterson and the angel wannabe Asrael, they had time to kill, maim, and murder a lot more people in and around Dublin than if the players had chosen to dedicate time and effort to finishing off these two particular creeps at an earlier stage. And you might end up saying, but how would they have done that? How would they have made, why would they have gone for that when they had these much more pressing problems in front of them? And that's certainly a valid question. But the pressing problems in front of them were particularly pressing because they had originally made a choice to follow up on that, and the events that played out all followed on that initial decision that this is the storyline that we're going to pursue. And nothing, incidentally, stops them from abandoning a certain storyline at pretty much any given time throughout the story. That's entirely their right to do, and then they could have decided, oh, you know what, this whole vampire thing, we're going to leave that to the others in the set because they have all their own reasons to get rid of the leeches. We don't. We have more. We have a greater interest in something else. We want to hunt down the rest of the McAlpin associates in the city, or try to figure out what the hell is going on with Janet's mother and this really creepy surgeon that they have now heard about, and who has been on the back burner for a while because they've had other things to deal with and other things on their mind. But those storylines are still there, and they could still pick them up if that's what they want to do. So again, this is the advantage of a free-form campaign. I'm able to, as the storyteller, to change things up more readily than you would be able to in a pre-written campaign, where you have a set end goal at the end of it, and that's where you kind of know that the campaign is eventually going to end up, unless you suffer a total party kill or TPK before you get that far. That obviously is always a concern. You might all end up dying horribly at the hand of a goblin. You never know. But the so yeah. Anyway, the for me personally, I've said several times that I prefer the freeform methods to the pre-written methods, and I do. I'm not saying that that is what everyone should feel like. Let me just underscore that. It's mostly a matter of this is the kind of role-playing I grew up with. As I've also explained in previous videos, I have been in this hobby for, by now, 31 years. So yeah, I've been doing this long enough to have seen role playing develop from what it was in the mid '80s, where it was very very much a niche thing, and to where it is today, where it's I hesitate to say that it's mainstream. I don't think it is. But it's still seen as somewhat of a geeky hobby, but it's less so. It's more commonplace. There are more different methods of it. There's been a rise of interest in fantasy and in science fiction, both with the continuing development of the computer game scene, but also with Hollywood creating blockbusters like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I mean, if you think about this, the Lord of the Rings came out around the turn of the century or millennium. That's when these movies were originally made. We are now talking, 15 years since the final movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy was released. But since then, we've seen very nearly an overabundance of new fantasy flicks come out. Many more books have come out. It's as if those movies kind of made it legitimate to have an interest in high fantasy, and the same with science fiction. There are more and more good movies and good computer games out there within this genre as well, and consequently, it's less. It's less taboo to be a role player. I mean, you should probably realize by now that, considering that I've been playing these games since the mid '80s, I'm old enough to remember organizations like BADD, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm old enough to have seen the scares of, oh, but this makes your kid go out and kill themselves because when their character dies, they'll never be able to cope with it. All of these things are part of my experiences as a role player. For goodness sakes, when I was 11 years old, or 12, I think, my parents basically told me that they disapproved so thoroughly of this hobby that I wasn't allowed to spend more than half an hour a week on it, and I basically told them where they could stick that notion. Fight the power, fight the machine, and all that. Basically, it was my primary way of socializing with my friends, and if I had cut it down to half an hour a week, obviously I wouldn't even have been able to play, and I would have lost contact with most of my friends because I was that kind of geek. So yeah, I did not comply with that demand at all. Nowadays, I don't think there are that many people out there who would, in all seriousness, make a claim such as role-playing makes you want to go out and commit suicide. It's a hobby which is in fact not just a hobby, but which is used in psychological therapy in many parts of the world, and consequently, obviously, it's kind of gotten the seal of approval. But to return to the issue at hand with pre-written versus narrative freeform, I am myself, as I said, I'm a freeform person, because when I learned how to play role-playing games, and when I was introduced to it and so on, there weren't that many pre-written campaigns, and the ones that were there were typically very, very, very bad. They were poorly written, both linguistically and technically. They had loopholes in them. You could drive a truck through. They weren't very good. I played a few such campaigns early on, and they were horrible for the most part. A lot of them were basically nothing more than dungeon crawling and let's go in there and kill the orc. I mean, I've used to read a comic strip on a regular basis in a 1980s and 1990s role-playing magazine called Dragon Magazine. And for many years, several years at least, there was a comic strip in that called Yamara, which was a meta comic about a halfling fighter rogue who got up to all kinds of hijinks. And there is a particular strip in which a rather unsavory dwarf that plays a part in the earlier storyline is having a mental breakdown when he realizes that his younger relatives aren't really interested in picking up a good battle axe and going down into the horrible mine Odum and destroying the monsters in hand-to-hand fighting, because that's what he's been used to doing. Instead, his younger relatives pick up a crate of dynamite and simply explode the entire population of this dungeon. Because, as they say, this is, move with the times. This is the modern and efficient method of dungeoneering. And the dwarf flips out 6 ways from Sunday and goes, "What happened to the good old days? What happened to you walk into a 10-foot by 10-foot room and orc is guiding a chest?" And that's really what pre-written campaigns were like back then. It was dungeon crawling and getting more loot. And while that can be fun and a nice throwback, most players today probably expect more in terms of a story. And for that reason, I wasn't a fan of the pre-writtens back then, and I learned how to be a storyteller and a GM by learning to think on my feet, quite frankly. So I'm biased. That's what I'm trying to say with all this. I'm biased in favor of the freeform, but being biased doesn't mean, obviously, since I'm running campaigns that are pre-written, it doesn't mean that I'm not willing to try that. And I have to admit that the quality of these things has grown considerably. And at least in some respects, it does make my life easier, particularly for fantasy games, because let's face it, in fantasy games, it's often a huge help, if not necessarily a necessity, but certainly a great help, to have maps, hexagonal or square maps, to play on, and obviously pre-written adventure paths or campaigns would come with the majority of the maps you will need throughout this story. That's just one tiny little piece of assistance that can be make life easier, obviously, for a storyteller. And I'm not discounting that at all. I think it's absolutely valid to look to such details as a reason to run pre-written campaigns, because it does lessen the amount of work. And since, oh gasp, oh horror, most people actually have this strange thing called a life. I'm still trying to figure out what that is. But they have this thing called life, and that means that sitting there for 5, 6, 8 hours every week setting up detailed maps might not be their idea of fun, and it might not be their spouse's idea of fun either, for that matter. They might have, a thing or two to say about their husband or wife being on the computer yet again, creating yet more dungeons with 10-foot by 10-foot rooms where orcs are guarding chests. So obviously that makes the pre-written campaign preferable in situations like that. I would say that specifically for fantasy settings, at least, it's usually preferable. it's not quite as necessary for certain games that are more narrative in scope, but for Pathfinder or Rollmaster or Dungeons and Dragons or all of these, it's definitely a big help, because while they have a narrative element, they are also very much a matter of go out, kill ye olde monster, and take his fat loot. Therein lies an issue I personally have with pre-written campaigns, that they very easily devolve into traveling from encounter to encounter. This is fine with some people. Some people enjoy that kind of story where they're basically having a minimum, or at least a drastically reduced amount of socializing time. That's not my thing personally. I think socializing and sitting around doing nothing whatsoever of any importance to the story is incredibly important for character development. I think it's incredibly important for players to get a chance to know and understand not only their own characters better, but also the characters of everyone else in the group. It's important for developing relationships. And I think that's easier to do in a free-form campaign. You can far more easily take a whole evening where you sit around doing really nothing except singing campfire songs in a game like Song of Tara. Singing campfire songs, incidentally, would be known as a moot. Or you can then you would be able to, in a game like Jade Regent, where there is sort of this underlying current that, oh, but we are also supposed to do this, that, or the other, because, you know, that's what our experience gain is hinging upon. And even if we have a really nice game master who actually gives us XP even though we don't kill anything, it's still there is still a different feel to such a campaign, at least in my experience. That means that people are less likely to take an entire game evening, game session, where they don't do anything of any kind. Not every player enjoys this kind of socializing RP where, as I said, nothing much of anything really happens. Not everyone thinks that's fun, and that's fine. I'm not telling people that they must enjoy this, but it's worth acknowledging that to some people, at least, this is really the crux of role-playing, is to make a character a person, not just a set of numbers on a piece of paper or on a computer file. This is incidentally something I should get back to in a future video, is the development of a character into a fully fledged person with their own distinct personality. But again, this is much easier to do if you, as the storyteller or GM, allow players to have these moments. And they are simply easier to do in freeform campaigns, in my opinion. I would say in finishing this, I will say that obviously there are advantages and disadvantages to both types of campaign. If you want a story that is easy to follow, is kind of one track with not that many things happen on the side, and where your players have a very clearly defined idea of what are we actually supposed to do, then obviously the pre-written campaign is preferable. That doesn't take a PhD in game design to realize this. But I also know that there are GMs out there. I've met them. I've played with them over the years. I see it quite routinely, who think that the challenge of taking on a freeform campaign is simply beyond them. It's too big a challenge, and they aren't sure if they can manage it. They aren't sure if they can come up with new ideas on the fly. And to that, I have to say, try it. It's, just let your players know that this is the first time you do this, and that you would like them to cut you some slack, because you might need a little bit of time now and again to think think things through. 3 T's in a row. To come up with an appropriate response to something. I think that happens to everyone. It happens to me as well, despite all my years of experience, because just once in a while the players will genuinely stump you. And again, the freeform campaign is sort of set up to allow players to do this. It means that players can go completely off the deep end, because it won't derail any underlying story. You just adjust it, or even if it does somehow derail the idea you've had and you can't simply adjust it, then say, okay, you failed in your stated objective. You weren't able to save the princess, and the dragon scorched her and ate her, just to take a very old trope. Fine. What do you want to do now? In a pre-written campaign, that is where you are basically setting out from the get-go to save the fair maiden from ye olde dragon, who is currently taking a very deep breath. And, well, there you have the doomsday clock kind of thing. It's taking a very deep breath, and you have 14 days to save the fair maiden before the dragon incinerates her or whatever. If you fail in doing that, the campaign is over. In a pre-written campaign, there's no more campaign. Obviously, that doesn't preclude you from, or your players from, saying, we like these characters, we'd like to continue playing them. But then anyway, you move over into a free-form campaign anyway. With a free-form campaign, it allows you to make up new stories, even if characters fail. And this is, I think, this is at the heart of the issue. In a free-form campaign, characters can fail far more readily than they can in a pre-written one. In a pre-written campaign, you sort of have to succeed almost all the way, almost at every step along the way, because otherwise you won't be able to progress in the story. In A Song of Tara, the players ended up sitting with a very strange sensation in their stomachs after Aaron's War was completed, when they realized that their archenemy had escaped. They realized that Molly, or Victoria Rogers, Molly Malone, whatever you want to call her, had actually hoodwinked them and managed to escape. And they ended up sitting there with a distinct feeling of having lost, of having been defeated. But the truth of the matter is, they weren't. They had still won a major victory. They had cleaned out Dublin of leeches for the first time in centuries, if not ever. And the werewolves were king of the molehill. They were the ones running the show all of a sudden. That hasn't happened in a very long time in any major city, and that is a huge, huge victory. But because this one character, this one NPC managed to elude their grasp and managed to get away, they ended up feeling, goodness, we lost, we failed. That opinion, that feeling didn't last forever, but I know it's still something that stings in them, that, damn, we didn't get her. And that is that feeling, in my opinion and in my experience, is much easier to engender and deal with in a freeform campaign. Again, because if you play a pre-written campaign, if you fail in any of the stated objectives along the way, you are far more likely to experience that the campaign simply stops there. Fail at killing the orc warlord, fail at saving the damsel from the dragon, fail at any of these things, and the campaign fails. That doesn't have to happen in a free form. So in absolute closing, if I had to make a recommendation here, I would say, if you are a new storyteller, a new GM, start out with the pre-written stuff, because the pre-written stuff will allow you to it will allow you to learn the ropes and get to know the system and the game worlds in a much more comprehensive and relaxing way than if you have to spend every moment of the game of every game session reacting on the fly to whatever your players come up with of harebrained schemes this week. And but if you have, I would say, even a couple of years experience under your belt, try the freeform method. Try it out for size and see how you like it. Again, not everyone enjoys it. I'm absolutely with you on that. I know that not everybody likes it, and some people will never grow to like it. But I'd still recommend that people try it on for sizes, and that they're not scared of the challenge they're in. If you notice what happens in A Song at Tara, for example, we rarely change maps. It's pretty much every time we play, they are looking at the same map, this aerial shot of St. Stephen's Green. Very rarely will I swap them over to an aerial photo of some part of Dublin or other, but they don't actually have a battle map set up, for example. We handle that purely as freeform. And that's a skill that you need to develop. Obviously, it's not something that just pops up in your head, and it can be chaotic initially, because you have to think in abstract terms. Okay, I'm 5 meters away from this guy, and I'm 20 meters away from this guy, and the second guy has cover because he's hiding behind a cover or a corner of a house. That sort of thing. You have to actually be able to visualize these things in your head. But again, practice makes perfect. So yeah, those would be my closing remarks on this issue. And well, we have reached 100 at the time I'm recording this. We have reached 100 subscribers to our lovely little channel here, which we are of course extremely grateful for. We hope that you will all continue to follow us and all continue to enjoy this. We are currently debating whether to do something special for this momentous occasion that we've reached 100 subscribers. I can't promise anything, but we are at least considering it at this time. So yeah, that's me for now, signing off, and hoping that I will continue to see you here on the channel. Leave a comment if you have anything to say about this. Please be polite about it, be nice, no reason to sling mud around. But other than that, have fun with your own game experiences. And I should say that if anybody actually feels like there are some issues or some things that they would like for us to talk about in a video like this, or for Daniel to deal with in one of his videos, or anything of the sort, then leave a comment and suggest it. We just might pick you up on it. You never know. So, as I said, that's me signing off, and have fun out there. Bye for now.